2019 was one of those seasons which, let's be honest, no one really remembers. It was another year of Mercedes and Hamilton domination. Ferrari could have maybe challenged for the title, but opted to f*** themselves instead. But at least F1 Twitter wasn't really a thing yet. Silver linings, I guess. The year did have some fantastic races, however. Take, for instance, Pierre Gasly's shot podium in Brazil, or Leclerc's engine killing itself, robbing him of his first victory in Bahrain. And then there's Germany, the race where Mercedes imploded, and we got arguably the best Grand Prix of the decade. Hey there guys, I'm Will, welcome to FP1, and I think it's time we took a short view back to the past. Come on, I couldn't resist. Let's start by setting the scene for you all. It's the 11th round of the 2019 Formula 1 World Championship. #Blessed has already won 7 races, while his teammate Valtteri Bottas has been typically average, despite his recent addiction to porridge of all things. Bottas would actually need to perform here, as his seat was under threat from Mercedes reserve Esteban Ocon, and Toto had given the Finn just 2 races before the summer break to prove himself. You can see where this is going, can't you? Though Hamilton leads the championship by 39 points, that could have been a lot less, had Ferrari decided to be competent for once. This, of course, was the year they were caught allegedly using illegal engines, but since they had sleeper agents inside the FIA, this was all okay. Ferrari at least had the handicap of being Ferrari, so realistically we weren't thinking much about the championship at this stage. And neither were Mercedes, as they were more focused on celebrating 125 years in motorsport. Rolling out a modified livery meant to hark back to the 1950s, where the silver paint was scratched off to save weight. Let's be honest though, because come on, we're all thinking the same thing, it does just look like a giant bird with shit all over the front of it. Mercedes would also show up looking like this. I guess you can't go much further back than 1950, then you get to some German history you might not want to celebrate. The bird car would scrape more paint off in first practice, when Bottas went for an exciting trip into the gravel. And further back, the 2019 Haas went the fastest it had ever gone, after a power unit issue saw Kevin Magnussen towed back to the pits, and Daniel Ricciardo experimented with some stunt driving out of turn 1, something he may now have to go back to since he's been sacked by McLaren. It was Sebastian Vettel in P1 though, which is a weird sentence to say in 2022, with Leclerc in hot pursuit, and the Ferraris would top FP2 as well, though it wasn't plain sailing, the mechanics dropping Charles during a practice pit stop. I guess some things never change. Pierre Gasly, meanwhile, summed up his Red Bull career by ripping half his car off out of the final corner. The Scuderia would make it a clean sweep of practice in FP3, Leclerc once again topping the session, this time ahead of Max Verstappen. Sebastian Vettel, meanwhile, gave payback to the bird that had ruined the Mercedes livery. Speaking of the championship leaders, they weren't having as much fun. 4th and 6th, and even beaten by the Haas of Kevin Magnussen. I think that's enough of an insult in itself. It wasn't good for Mercedes then, and with just a couple of hours before qualifying, it didn't seem possible for them to turn things around. But then you've got to remember that this is 2019, and if Ferrari looked competitive, they'd find a way to f*** it all up. The woes began in Q1, when home favourite Sebastian Vettel reported problems that would take him out of the session. His teammate Charles Leclerc fared a little better, making it into Q3 before his car opted to commit suicide. All the while, #Blessed would cruise to pole position, ahead of Verstappen and Bottas heading into Sunday. But hold on, I thought you said this was Mercedes' worst ever Grand Prix. Yeah, we're about to get to that. On race day, we'd be greeted by rain, and a ton of it. That would cause drama off the start, as both Red Bulls decided they didn't fancy challenging for the lead and drifted back into irrelevancy. The Mercedes had no such issues though. Despite Bottas making up his own line into turn 1, they now held 1st and 2nd, with the fast starting Raikkonen benefiting up to P3. Sadly, Kimi wasn't in a Ferrari anymore, and Kelly had promised Max a special evening over team radio as long as he pulled his finger out of his arse and stopped making Gasly look competent. Verstappen would oblige, taking P3 back from the Alfa Romeo into the hairpin. All the while, Vettel was making great headway from the back of the pack. He was now up to 13th on lap 2, which became 12th when Sergio Perez decided he couldn't be f***ed anymore and drove his racing point into the wall. That brought out the safety car and saw the majority of the field come into the pit lane, opting to switch off the full wets, and having just seen Perez spin into the wall, thought it was about time for the intermediate tyres. Some cars had more sense and decided to stay out, including the Williams duo of George Russell and Robert Kubica. This meant Vettel would have to make his way past them again, and near the end of his race when Kubica almost ran into the side of him. In Robert's defence, he had been in a Williams all year. meaning this was probably the first time he'd encountered another car. I guess you could say he just wasn't very handy when it came to battling them. I'm going to hell. Slightly up the road, Lando Norris was experiencing what it would be like to be Daniel Ricciardo in 2022, as he got passed by an Alfa Romeo. Thankfully for Danny Rick's stands, he was still good in 2019, though still had to put up with Renault engines, and that was his race done. At this point, there have been a few close calls at the Hockenheim ring's final turn. You see, the runoff doubled as the start line for the drag strip at the circuit, which basically meant dipping a wheel on there was a one-way trip to retirement. In one case, literally. A few teams would now decide to gamble on slicks, and I'm sure it won't surprise you whatsoever to hear that Ferrari were one of them. It would be Red Bull that almost paid the price though, Verstappen going for a 360 before complaining that he should have been on the soft tyres, not the mediums. Not too sure what difference that would have made. Meanwhile, another Renault engine would decide to blow up, this time inside the McLaren of Lando Norris, but fair play to Lance Stroll here, who went to make sure that Britain was all okay. The incident regardless brought out the VSC and allowed Leclerc to make a cheap pit stop as he switched onto the softs. Unfortunately for Mercedes, Hamilton was too far around the track at this stage, and despite having the whole lap to prepare for him coming in, they still weren't ready with new tyres when they eventually did. To make matters worse, the VSC would end just as Lewis entered the pit lane, meaning Charles Leclerc had an almighty opportunity to take the lead. Now, would anyone like to take a guess what happened here? I'll give you a clue. He completely f***s it. Leclerc caught up with a Mercedes, but it was the German manufacturer's advertising board, not Lewis Hamilton. But Ferrari had at least saved Mercedes. They were now 1-2 with the full safety car out. You see, this is where things begin to go tits up though. Hashtag blessed, hashtag f***ed it, just like Leclerc had done a lap before, skidding off and damaging his front wing at the final corner. He limped back to the pits, where it turned out Mercedes had decided to go back to 1950 when it came to their pit stops as well. Jesus, that made Ferrari at Zandvoort look good. All of that somehow put Verstappen up into the lead, ahead of Nico Hülkenberg of all people, who looks set to take his maiden podium at his home Grand Prix. I mean, what a story that would have been. Oh, never mind. With yet another safety car, Lance Stroll would take the gamble and switch to slicks, working hugely in his favour as by lap 48 he would inherit the lead. So could he now take the win? Nah, this is still Lance Stroll, let's not forget. Mercedes, meanwhile, were still producing the Skillshare course of how to f*** up a race weekend, which I imagine all Ferrari engineers are required to complete upon joining the team. Lewis was now out of the points, having been left too long on the Inters, leaving salvaging the Grand Prix in the hands of the ever unimpressive Porridge Man. They would be joined in the imploding crew by none other than Haas. The two blew each other up, going side by side into the hairpin. But still, not the worst explosion I've seen from that team. Now, I mentioned Porridge Man, so let's see how he's getting on.
Oh, that's sliding out, that's Valtteri Bottas!
Oh, brilliant. And yes, somehow this man kept his drive for another 2 years. Anyway, with it now a sprint to the flag, Verstappen would soar off into the distance as Stroll and Kvyat, who'd also gambled on slicks, were trying to cling on to the podium places. But here comes Sebastian Vettel. From the back of the grid, the German would climb all the way up to P2 by the end of the Grand Prix, and arguably one of his best drives in Formula 1. Kvyat would hang on to P3 and take a memorable podium for the Toro Rosso team, maybe just proving to Red Bull that they shouldn't have dropped him in 2016. Nah, who am I kidding, Red Bull are never wrong. But with Gasly underperforming, maybe there was a route back. Actually, we've not spoken about him for a while. I wonder how he's getting on. Oh, Pierre had tried to pass Alex Albon, which, as you can see, didn't go very well. But there was no such issues for Max Verstappen, who would take the win in what has to be one of the most exciting races of all time. Mercedes might not agree with that statement though, as they had well and truly f***ed things. And if you're still wondering why the team didn't run their one-off red livery in Spa this year, the superstitions from this Grand Prix played a big part in that. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're new here, I cover all the modern day races just like this in my comedy review series. So if you've enjoyed it, be sure to get subscribed, and I'll see you for the Italian Grand Prix later this week. I'm also well up for doing more classic races, so let me know which ones I should do down in the comments below. A big thank you as always to all my patrons, especially Tim Bresser, who started supporting the channel after the last video. If you want to get involved, or just check out any of my other socials, all the links for that are down in the description below. Anyway, that's all from me. I'll see you soon with another video, but until then, have a good one.